Hello and welcome to this quick bite session for Year 9 on transferable skills. So this session's for anyone who's new to teaching Year 9 or perhaps new to teaching Year 9 in the Trust, or maybe you're a non-specialist and just want a bit of an insight into these transferable skills that we're seeing throughout the scheme. So this session is really dedicated to looking at how writing and reading skills are complemented, especially within this power and conflict scheme for Year 9. So you'll notice that in week 2, students are looking at the Prelude by William Wordsworth. And then there is a writing lesson where they develop a piece of description on a particular setting. And the idea is that students use what they recognise as being best practice essentially from Wordsworth, and they use that understanding of how he's crafted to create that tone and atmosphere within the setting he describes and to impart that into their own piece of creative writing. So really, if you are familiar with like design technology and art lessons, it's a bit like the way that students craft a piece of art. So if we just take Andy Warhol, for instance, it could be that the students are given the image of Marilyn Monroe, that's quite famous, and that's the style model. That's what students are hopefully going to achieve by the end of their crafting. And so what they might do is divide the image into a grid and begin stenciling out like a template really. And you can see that black and white outline version of Marilyn Monroe. So they've mastered the template of that, and they then begin to think about, well, what are the other techniques the artist has used to help develop that portrait even further. So it could be that they're given some skill sessions on shading, for instance, and then they use that skill that they've just acquired and they apply it to their drawing. In much the same way that, especially within Key Stage 2, I think, they might look at the leaflet as a style model, and the purpose of that style model is to persuade. And so the skills session that the students do would be focused upon developing their awareness of persuasive techniques, not just identifying them, but equally understanding how to create their own. And so after they've acquired that skill, they would then use it as part of their own piece of writing. So really, at those first 3 stages, it's about understanding, deconstructing the style model, applying it, and then deepening understanding of how it's constructing it to a point where we get to mastery, where students are quite confident in producing their own examples of the style model. And then when they get to the next stage, where we've got the example there of the Barack Obama campaign post that's done in the style really of what Andy Warhol's done previously of Marilyn Monroe, they're then manipulating the genre. And really, you want to get students to that point where they've understood the style model. In our case for Year 9, that would be Wordsworth, and their presentation of setting, and how they've used pathetic fallacy, for instance, as a way of demonstrating tone, but perhaps manipulating those key skills in developing their own piece of writing for a completely new image. So this is what the week looks like in a nutshell, really. They think about the concept of human power in their first reading of the Prelude. They then begin to really understand how the writer's methods have developed this idea of power and the idea that humanity feels powerless and at times has to be empowered, or that nature seems to be in a position that's quite influential, like a teacher, for instance. And then once they've understood those methods, students are then asked to create their own piece of creative writing based on an image of a setting. And that's how they work it through. So what we're going to do in the next couple of slides is to think about the different stages it's taken for the students to get to a point where they can manipulate the writer's craft within their own writing. So I suppose the first stage in the week is them understanding the poem, and its most sort of simplistic way. What does the poem actually mean, and what do we understand from it? And then begin to think about tone, and if that tone changes a little bit in our readership of it, and how do we view the speaker at the beginning of the poem, and do we still hold the same opinion, or has that changed towards the end? So that's the very basic one, and maybe perhaps because we're thinking about power and human power, just tracking the development of power throughout that poem. So rather than go through the text box, the main thing here is to understand that the students are re-deconstructing the poem And that is the reading skill, isn't it? They're looking at those question prompts, they've been given a highlighted part in red, and they're developing their analysis of the writer's methods. But the actual step, I suppose, for writing is why have they chosen that word and what impact would that word have? And if we were to use that in a piece of writing, how would that shape tone and atmosphere within it? So it's again, as you're teaching, thinking about the reading skill, that's important for the moment of that lesson, but equally kind of calling back to it in the writing lesson later on. So after the students have analysed the writer's text, they're then presented with a series of provocations. And if anything, it's a way of demonstrating that there are a range of meanings that can be created by that one single method. So in a writing lesson, you could use this as a bit of a callback really to demonstrate that the method they've selected or the word choice they've selected, they need to think quite carefully about the range of meanings they want to present and how can they maybe group words together as part of a semantic field to kind of really communicate one idea or one meaning. Or do they want that meaning to be more ambiguous? And so they're going to give them perhaps some contrasting images or the use of imagery, for example, to help develop that even further. So again, rather than just seeing this as only a reading skill, fit for their previous reading lesson, that actually it's a skill that students need to kind of call back upon when they're developing their own writing, and that can be used as part of the editorial process. So when they read back through their work, was that vocabulary that they've selected, was that fit for purpose, for instance? So if we were to go back to the very first slide of this session, they've looked at the style model and now we're probably at the can we transfer it across? So can we now borrow methods, words that we've just seen in the prelude and use it to apply it to this image? So you can see here you've got about 5 different tasks in the purple boxes, and they're thinking about bombarding the image with as many words as possible that would help them to describe this scene. Begin to think about the key parts of the image that they're going to choose, think about the time of day, which character, again drawing upon the sort of persona of the speaker in the prelude, how they shift in terms of power, perhaps how the tone shifts and how we see that communicated. So again, really focusing upon what we can magpie, I suppose, from the previous reading lesson and now put it as part of our planning in this session here. So if we went back to the learning question for this lesson, the focus is on how you sequence a piece of descriptive writing and really thinking about the importance of setting. And this grid's a really good way of getting students to think about sequencing, but it's also an opportunity to go back to that very first lesson when students approached the text and read it through and they thought about the character's journey, I suppose in this case really the speaker's journey, and the development of power, and to think about the tone and when that tone changes. And that sequencing helps to support the description here. So you can see we've got the tone, the mood, the atmosphere, the time of day, the time of year, the weather, location, the colours, sounds, then the character. And so it's a way of organising those earlier ideas that they've just blasted around the image and beginning to think about parallels between them, or perhaps moments of contrast, or that development. So if you remember when we talked about the Andy Warhol images, this is the shading really, isn't it? Them really thinking about how that word or the method that they've written down previously in their earlier planning, where is that going to pop up in the sequence in the description? Where would it be most effective? So they're beginning to evaluate now and consider their approach. So the logical next step is to get to that end stage of developing their own piece of writing. And it's not an exact replica of the prelude, and it shouldn't be, but it perhaps has the borrowings of it. And that understanding that they've seen a good piece of writing from an excellent writer, and they're now embodying it within their own writing, but perhaps they're manipulating it. So it could be that they're really focused upon light, less or more so than perhaps Wordsworth has, or maybe they use light in a far more positive way than perhaps Wordsworth did previously, or vice versa. So it's to be encouraged that students begin to deviate away, that they begin to build in features like metaphor, simile, even alliteration, sibilance, to really think about the sound effects created by their writing. But it's that opportunity for students now to take ownership of their writing because they've seen such a secure style model previously. they will be able to feel a bit more confident in taking risks and developing their writing further. That's the end for this quick bite session for Year 9 transferable skills. I think the one takeaway really from this session is when delivering reading skills lessons, especially within this scheme, think about its transference across that writing skills lesson that you have at the end of the week. So what are the key areas that you're going to really focus on when you're delivering the reading element, I suppose, the scheme, and how are you going to demonstrate to students how that's kind of developed and moved across into their writing? So what aspects do you really want to focus on? So, for instance, if you've looked at pathetic fallacy, how are you going to deconstruct that for students, as well as kind of linking it back to where they've seen a really good example of that in the poem that just been taught?